Good afternoon and welcome to the second conference of the conference cycle of Environmental Humanities. We are very happy and honored to have with us Graham Parks, the world's foremost authority on comparative philosophy. So just before we start, I will just say something about Graham's biography. I mean, all of you know Graham, but we just need to remind how great his work is. So, a native of Glasgow, Graham Parks has taught philosophy at universities in the United States, Europe, and East Asia, and he is now professorial research fellow at the University of Vienna. His main interests are in continental European, Chinese, and Japanese philosophies, aesthetics and philosophy of art, and environmental philosophies. Among his books and translations are Heidegger and Asian Thought, The Self-Overcoming of Nihilism, Nietzsche and Asian Thought, Composing the Soul, Riches of Nietzsche's Psychology, Heidegger's Hidden Sources, East Asian Influences on his work by Reinhard May, Reading Zen in the Rocks, The Japanese Dry Landscape Garden by François Berthier, Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche, and How to Think About the Climate Crisis, a philosophical guide to saner ways of living, which is published recently in 2021. And he has also published over 120 chapters in books and journal articles on his topics of interests. So now, Graham, the stage is yours, please.
Yes, I use the word insanity in my title because I'm a Nietzschean, and Nietzsche pointed out that although insanity is relatively rare in particular persons, in groups, parties, peoples, and ages, it's the rule. And I don't think even Nietzsche could have imagined that the whole of humanity would go insane, but I think that's what's happening now. I think there are two syndromes, two sets of symptoms that make me think we're going insane. The first one is that we're pretty mindless of the possibility of nuclear holocaust. And you'd be pleased to hear I'm not going to talk about that because that would take another presentation. The second syndrome, though, is that we're bringing on species extinction, not just other species, but more importantly, the species that we are, Homo sapiens. And I think there are two parts to this. We're not only wrecking the climate in a way that's extremely dangerous, but we're also wrecking the biosphere. And when you put these two dangers together, it gets pretty scary. Beginning with the climate, if you want to know what's happening with the climate, I thoroughly recommend, I think the best place to go is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They've been producing reports they've gone through 20, I don't know, almost 20 of them, I suppose, now. And there's their website. The latest one, the assessment report number 6, synthesis report, is extremely good. It just came out this year. It's only 40 pages, so there's not much excuse for not reading it. And it's very well presented, and I thoroughly recommend it. In fact, I don't talk to people about climate change unless they've read this, because otherwise there's no point. Yes, angst. I mean, the situation, if you read that report, it's difficult to come out of it and not feel a considerable amount of angst about the situation we're in. And I constantly read reports that young people especially, suffering from climate anxiety. Not just young people. I suffer from it on my own on bad days. But what this says to me is that we need action. That we don't, if philosophers just continue to think and talk, we won't get anywhere. We need to actually do stuff. And I have a little maxim up at the top there in the middle, AAA, which is that action alleviates anxiety. almost always. So it's actually 5A formula. But yeah, I think we need to, I hope that young people can start to alleviate their anxiety by actually doing something or doing many things. And toward the end, I'll suggest some of those things that could be done. But I want to begin with the idea of planetary boundaries, because I think that the Earth system science is the place to go now. It's even beyond the IPCC. So I recommend these papers that I'm going to mention as well. Used to be we all traditional societies think in terms of the heavens and the earth on which we stand, and the heavens that we see when we look up. There are 4 major Earth systems. There are quite a few other subsystems, starting with the geosphere, the ground on which we stand. Then there's the hydrosphere, all the water on the Earth. The cryosphere is water when it's frozen. We got the biosphere, the sphere of living things. And then farther up, we have the atmosphere. And all these systems interact. These interact together. I think Earth system science started being very relevant in 2009 with a paper called A Safe Operating Space for Humanity, because people were concerned that when you push these systems too far, any one of them, they can suddenly flip into a very different state. And then you're stuck in that state. You can't go back. And they identified usually 8 or 9 systems. You see here right at the top, we have climate change. And the safe operating space is the green part in the center there. And with climate change, we're quite a bit over into the red. The other really important one linked closely to climate change is on the left there, biodiversity loss. And over on the right, you keep seeing the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. That has to do with, mainly with screwing those up through industrial agriculture. Again, you see how far we are beyond the safe space already in 2009 with the nitrogen cycle. 6 years later, a paper on planetary boundaries, where climate change at the top is still a problem. Now they're to the left, they're talking about biosphere integrity rather than biospecies extinction, because it has to do with the way the whole biosphere hangs together. A big one over on the left there is land systems change, primarily deforestation. And people have been warning about this for decades, but we go on deforesting. Over on the right there, I've put tipping points in red because, again, they are stressing we're getting close to some tipping points. The thing is, you don't know. You could go over a tipping point before you know it. And they say we really have to rein ourselves in, because you go over one of these tipping points, it's more likely that then another tipping point will be reached in an adjacent system because they're connected. So these tipping points are something we really want to avoid. Note there on the top right, novel entities, a new category, because they're realizing that synthetics are piling up, mainly plastics. And this was after the Second World War. Something very important happened, was that firms like DuPont promised us better things for better living through chemistry. I love that phrase. Slogan, better living through chemistry. Well, better living if you like to wear nylons, but you've also got lots of plastics in the system, which of course don't biodegrade. So that causes you a real problem. And just earlier this year, the same group of people, mainly a lot of them are in Stockholm at the Environmental Institute, a lot of them are in Potsdam, Earth System Boundaries 2023 didn't have any red ink on it. So I put some red ink at the top left there, because if you look at what's going on here, all but one of these systems, we're way over the green zone. Climate, just a bit over. Functional integrity to the right, that's the biosphere. Then we have natural ecosystem area. They figured we want to keep about 40% of the Earth's surface as natural ecosystems. Otherwise, because all these systems are interconnected, otherwise other things get screwed up. And that's a really difficult one for people to realize why, we keep let's say, if Bolsonaro hadn't destroyed the Amazon rainforest, we keep that an integral whole, we keep that as a functioning ecosphere. Why should we care? We live in Europe. Well, we should care because it's all interconnected. And so it's very important to keep natural ecosystem areas intact, at least some of them. And now they're talking about deep sea mining, which is there's a whole other ecosystem that covers the whole Earth that because of people wanting to make money, they're saying, yeah, we just dredge it all up. And if we do that, we're going to be in real trouble. Going down to the bottom right there, surface waters. We're damming so many rivers, or we have dammed so many rivers without realizing, at the beginning anyway, that downstream of those, that changes all the ecosystems downstream. And so it's something that you want to do. You want to be very careful about building new dams. I don't know about the dams that are already built. I suppose you leave them there, but it's going to cause problems. Right at the bottom there, aquifers, groundwater. You may have seen in the news that there's extreme concern in many parts of the world that the fresh water that we drink, that's under the surface of the earth in aquifers, is running out in many places. And that's a very expensive thing to remedy. If you live on the coast, you can build a desalinization plant, but that's very expensive. Then the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles you see are way over as usual. So not a happy situation. Now, I think one of the problems is that you notice there's a lot of talk about cycles, that's the way the natural world works. That's the way these Earth systems work. You've got the phosphorus cycle, nitrogen cycle, and the carbon cycle, three very important ones. And if you look at indigenous worldviews, or you look at the Chinese tradition, for example, they're all built on cycles. The whole thing is predicated on, yes, that's how it works. Things go round and round and round. They're used to talking about things that are moving in cycles. But in the modern West, we've got this idea that came in part through a different understanding of time that we get through Christianity for some reason. Or not. Why is it stopping on cycles? Sorry, is it something? No, I can't move. Can't move. I can't go forward or backward. What? Oh, that was it.
This is the next one or not? No.
Yeah, usually.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
works.
yeah, okay,
So
right.
just use the.
Okay. No, I was using that, but I've got to tap that one. Okay, so, yeah, partly through the Judeo-Christian understanding of time, that there's a beginning to it and an end to it. We have this idea of linear progress, and especially in economics, of course, it's got to go not only onward, but also upward. And nobody thought of this, but that's a very different way of moving and proceeding than cycles. And in fact, it's going to conflict with cycles. And you see that with the advent of capitalism, that for a while, we were able to extract raw materials from various sources in the world, and the economy could work with producing things, consuming things. You could go round and round in circles, and for a while it worked okay. But once capitalism had got going full on, you have a much more linear idea, which is what we're predicating our activity on now, where you go from extraction to excretion, as Marx famously called it. You've got a linear flow. And if you've got these plastics and these synthetic chemicals, they all are chemical compounds that we started introducing into the Earth system only after actually in the 20th century, you're going to have problems because these you have waste rather than it being recycled again into the system. before, anything that looked like waste, like excrement, would be taken up into the system again. But once you start producing synthetics, you can't do that. Okay, so why we're doing this? Why do we keep on doing this? Because in almost all of politics, the idea is that gross domestic product has to keep growing. You have to keep economic growth going, and that's the first political imperative. And this is the thing. This is what gives me even more anxiety than I used to have when I wrote that book. But suppose we resolve the climate crisis tomorrow. I mean, magically we cut carbon emissions to zero and stop deforesting and all the rest of it. Well, it's not going to matter, because as long as we continue to deplete the soil, as long as there's chemical pollution, as long as there's deforestation, habitat destruction, overfishing, and elimination of species, then all of these are direct consequences of economic growth and of increasing gross domestic product. Then we're going to end up with a planet that's pretty unlivable anyway. So we've got twin problems here. We've got the climate crisis on the one hand, and we've got the, call it the larger environmental crisis, the biosphere integrity crisis on the other. And these are two massive problems, because you have to not only fix the climate, but you have to stop economic growth as measured by GDP. I'll come back to that one. It sounds almost impossible. The only reason for hope for me is that the more you fix one, the more it helps the other. So because these two areas are interconnected. Well, are we doing anything about these problems? And if so, what? Well, apparently we're not intending to do anything about them. A report that just came out, this is a very up-to-date presentation. There's a lot of very new stuff here from reports that just came out in the last couple of months from the United Nations Environment Programme and various other entities, talking about the production gap. And if you look at the bottom on the right-hand side of the chart there, you see that bottom line is the 1.5 degree of global warming that people have said this is what we have to aim for, 1.5. Now we're at 1.2 right now. And if you look at what happened in the last year, this doesn't look good. And if you think, okay, you add 50% to that, do we want it to be 50% worse? Well, it's not a linear progression with systems like this. It's a what do you call it? The opposite of a linear progression, when it goes all the way up. It's a exponential. Thank you. I'm so anxious, I'm losing my capacity for language. Yes, it's exponential. So in fact, it's not going to be just 50% worse at 1.5. It's going to be a lot worse. Now, the 1.5 scenario from where we are now means we are producing fewer and fewer fossil fuels and phasing them out, hopefully by 2050. But and then you have the line above that is 2 degrees, which would be horrendous, I think. But that red line at the top, oh, sorry, and then the dotted line, you see at the Paris Agreement, this is what governments agreed on. They pledged to say, yeah, we'll reduce by this much. You then look at their stated policies, which is the line not quite at the top there. You then look at what they're planning to do, the red line way at the top, government plans and projections. So that's vastly different from where we need to be going. I mean, the governments in 2015 in Paris said, oh yeah, we'll do it, we'll take action. Well, they're not. They're taking all the wrong actions. They're not doing anything to reduce this. For example, The Guardian late last year had a big project called the Carbon Bond Project, because they had identified, along with a lot of other organizations, 195 projects that are in the works, each of which would produce, each of which, of the 195, produce 1 billion tons of CO2 in its lifetime. So these are big oil and gas and coal exploration projects. And you see where they are, mostly in the US, not exactly a climate leader. A lot of them clustered, of course, around the Middle East because of all the oil. But Russia is doing pretty well there too. And this is the planned increase in fossil fuel production for 2030, so relative to 2021, so at the end of this decade. You see India, if you look at coal at the top there, India and Russia lead the field. You look at oil, Saudi Arabia, and then the US, because they've got all this, you know, they're fracking frantically in the US. Gas, Qatar, and Russia is also up there too. But these are petrostates who, they're not the oil companies. The oil companies have their own problems, and I'll mention some of them. But these are petrostates. How and yet they're all states who have said, no, we'll abide by, we'll take the Paris Agreement seriously. But they're absolutely not doing it. And one way to get them to start doing it is to vote the people out of office who are planning these things, because they're being planned because, well, there's a lot of money to be made. The other thing to mention at this point, I think, is that there is a tremendous inequality. I mean, people have known that between the global north and the global south, but what's becoming even more important now is the inequality between nations. Because in China, you have an enormous number of millionaires and many billionaires. And so the gap, the inequality gap in China is enormous. And this is an interesting project by Dario Kenner. He talks about the carbon elite, and he has been looking into, and many other people looking into, the role of the richest in climate change. And he has a database that you can find online, bottom right there, that whygreeneconomy.org. And fortunately, you can see the names. You can see who these people are. I mean, it's we know it because it is in the public domain. And so recently, just this month, in fact, The Guardian did a study and found that you just take 12 billionaires and that their climate emissions outpollute 2.1 million homes in the global north. I mean, it's incredible. Carlos Slim leads the pack there, but Bill Gates is close behind. And this is not just their consumption emissions, their multiple huge mansions, their private jets, their mega yachts and so on, but also mainly their investments, because these people invest heavily in the sorts of projects I just mentioned, those carbon bombs, because fossil fuels are a very good investment these days. And so most of the billionaires are heavily invested in carbon in fossil fuels. And so this is looking also at their investments as well. Also, this month of this year, Oxfam came out with a study called Climate Equality, A Planet for the 99%, where they base the latest year for which they have full records is 2019, bottom right there, and they find that the richest 1% were responsible for the same emissions as the poorest 66%. So that's 2/3 of humanity produce the same emissions as the richest 1%. That's 5 billion people in the 2/3 of humanity, and the 1% is exactly 1% of the 8 billion that we have. And interestingly, the graph looks like one of those old-style champagne glasses. You know, if you think of the good old days of the robber barons, they used to drink champagne and go all the way down the stem there. So at the top 1% there, the top 10% is in red. They're responsible for 50% of emissions. And I'm sorry, but we are they, we are them. because in the developed countries, in the global north, the middle classes, we make up that 10%. We're in that bracket. The next 40% are responsible for 43% of emissions, more or less where they should be. But the poorest 50% are responsible for 8% of emissions. I mean, these figures are staggering. I mean, I knew it was heading this way, but Oxfam has been doing these, I think for 3 or 4 years now. They've been coming out with these reports, and it just keeps getting worse. The inequalities worsen, and of course, the tragic irony is that those poorest 10% of the world's population, who are producing only 8% of the emissions, are the ones who are mostly in the countries who are suffering most from the effects. And okay, we're not. Northern Italy got badly hit this past couple of years with floods and so on. But for the most part, especially the very rich, can afford to insulate themselves from the worst effects of what they're producing. Okay, I have a confession to make. I came here by plane. I tried not to, but as you see, this is a headline from The Guardian last week. Flying in Europe is up to 30 times cheaper than the train. Cheap flights made possible by tax breaks for airlines are encouraging people to go the more carbon-intensive route. Not only would it take like 5 times as long, but it's a whole lot cheaper to travel by air, and that's crazy. And it's crazy because the governments are doing it that way. That's exactly, they're giving the tax breaks to the airlines. An airline like Ryanair, because it serves lots of small destinations that need tourists, well, the politicians there say, well, give Ryanair the subsidies. And here's another Guardian headline: European governments are shrinking railways in favor of road building. Rail networks in most countries have been starved of funding while motorways lengthen. That's, again, completely crazy. That you're building more motorways to encourage more cars, but we're trying to persuade people to take the train instead of cars. And again, that's precisely, I read that the subsidies for airlines are in the EU countries taken as a whole, are 3 times what they are for, going back to trains get 1/4 of the government subsidies for travel. And that's completely insane, because you think the EU should be doing better. It leads in many other respects. Okay, what's driving this insanity? Well, capitalism, of course. And this book by Jason Hickel, the first chapter is a very good, very concise history of capitalism. It's a revisionist history, because we're normally meant to think, yeah, capitalism kind of evolved naturally and so on. No, it was a horrendously violent and rapacious development in human history. You first of all had property, had people taking over. You had the rich and powerful enclosing the land and saying, no, we own this. Whereas before, farmers, peasants used to live on the land and farm it and survive that way. And when there was no land more to enclose in Europe and resources were running out, well, fortunately, there'd been enough people exploring the world that we could bring in colonialism and get the sources of our raw materials from other places. We also needed labor too, so slavery was a convenient way of doing that. And so Hickel has a very good chapter that goes for those pretty much 500 years, from 1500 when it started, showing that each successive chapter in the history of capitalism is just a horror show. And of course, that's behind much of most of our problems with the climate and with the biosphere, because capitalism the economy has to keep growing. You have to keep taking more and more stuff out of the ground and putting more and more stuff, CO2, into the air. Okay, now, of course, Marx, a famous critic of capitalism, said, look, philosophers have got to do something different. Just stop just interpreting the damn world, change the damn thing. And I always like to pair that with, apparently Nietzsche didn't know Marx, but Nietzsche, 20 years later, wrote the task of the true philosophers is to set about the improvement of that aspect of the world recognized as alterable. What aspect is that? The very alterable views of human beings. And that should be a call to arms for people in philosophy. If they say, well, I'm not much good at going on the street and carrying banners. Well, okay, why not try to change people's views? Because that's what's been happening, as I'm about to show you, that we have a view of who we are that comes from the libertarian tradition, the neoliberal tradition in economics and the libertarian. And I'm talking, in the old days, you had libertarians, they just wanted freedom, so you could have anarchist libertarians and socialist libertarians, but I'm talking about the 20th century kind, which is the right-wing libertarians. And their idea of individualism, this is where I think philosophy can help. So one very alterable view of human beings is dualism. That really took root not all over the world, but certainly in the Western world. The idea that you have a divide, a dichotomy between, on the top, soul, spirit, mind, whatever, and on the bottom, you have body and matter. And I mean, you see the beginnings of it with the Orphic Pythagorean tradition with the ancient Greeks, but it's really after Descartes that you get what I call, I don't like to coin terms, but I think individualism is fairly, I'm allowing myself that because it just means a hyphen in the middle of the word. It's a dualism that stresses the individual. And we don't have time to go into it, but actually Descartes himself, I don't think was the problem there. He was an esoteric writer. He couldn't say on the surface of his text what he meant. But that's why I think it's okay to call it Cartesian, because the idea that you've got individuated minds or egos controlling human bodies and the natural world as a realm of lifeless matter, that even the human body was res extensa for the Cartesians, is something that has really set its stamp on the progress of the history of philosophy in the West, and I think is in large part responsible for where we are now. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the 19th century, you had social Darwinism, another product, by the way, of Northern Europe. This tends to be a Northern European set of problems. You have people like Galton and Spencer who say, okay, well, we're progressing as a species, and we progress through competition among individuals, their interpretation of Darwin biologically, that the survival of the fittest, in which the fittest, in some social sense, prevail. So we're not only individuals, but we're in competition with each other. So we forget all the advantages that cooperation might have brought us. And I mean, you see that even in Darwin, just on a biological level. It's not only competition, a lot of it is cooperation. In the 1920s in the US, Lehman Brothers was starting to be a force to be reckoned with there. You have this man, Paul Mazur, who in 1928 published a book called American Prosperity. And he wrote, the community that can be trained to desire change, to want new things even before the old have been entirely consumed, yields a market to be measured more by desires than by needs. So the idea is coming into the market now. It's not just what people need. They don't buy just what they need, but actually what they want. That maybe a community can be trained to want change in the sense of satisfying their desires rather than just their needs. And he went on, and man's desires can be developed so that they will greatly overshadow his needs. this is the wet dream of the capitalist consumer society, that you can develop desires in such a way that people won't even know what they need. They know what they want, but they've forgotten what they need. Same year, a business associate of Mazur's, Edward Bernays, the grandson of Sigmund Freud, wrote a book called Propaganda, the Public Mind in the Making, same year in the US. And he wrote, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. I think the founders of democracy would be surprised to know that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of people's habits is such an important element. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government that is the true ruling power of this country. Bernays was the founder, he's called the father of public relations, with a book called Propaganda, Public Mind in the Making. Well, it's being made by people manipulating it, is the idea. And that this is what the true ruling power is becoming in the US in the 1930s, that people are being manipulated into thinking they need a lot of stuff that they actually don't. And this got enshrined the year after these two books were published. A US Department of Commerce publication called Recent Economic Changes in the United States. Herbert Hoover, the president, was the chair of it. Are buying into this completely. This is now government, or at least Department of Commerce principles. Wants are almost insatiable. One want satisfied makes way for another. Economically, we have a boundless field before us. There are new wants which will make way endlessly for newer wants as fast as they are satisfied. So again, capitalist consumerist wet dream. You set things up so that wants keep on replacing each other as fast as they can be satisfied. Now, shortly after the war, you had the Montpellier Society, founded by a bunch of what we would now call neoliberal economists, mainly, although they had Karl Popper, a philosopher there. Friedrich Hayek, top left, and Milton Friedman, bottom right, the most important figures. And their concern was to protect democracy from totalitarianism. We'd just gone through the Second World War, and fascism in Germany and Italy, and communism in the former USSR were to be protect. I mean, you had to protect democracy from these forces, and you did that by stressing individual freedom. You had to reduce regulation by governments, because when the government regulates me as an industrialist, I lose my freedom. You have to minimize taxation, because I earn all this money by owning a factory, and if you, the government, take it away, you're going to use it for things that I may not approve of. And so I lose the freedom of spending my well-earned money the way I want. And the way that both of these are brought about is to let the free market rule, that freedom is not only freedom of the individual, but freedom of the free market. And it's through Hayek, who, the background there is the University of Vienna. Every time I go in the front of that building, I wince, grimace, because there's a statue of Hayek on the left-hand side as you go in, because he won the Nobel Prize, and he is an alumnus of the University of Vienna. But he was the one who, after the war, pointed out to some pretty rich people that intellectuals are really important if they want to make more money, because they can influence how the great battle of ideas and policy works. So it's an ideological battle that pretty much got started. It didn't get the war of ideas wasn't declared because they wanted to keep it quiet. And you can you can see the documents in which they say we better not actually let people know that there's a war going on. But this was started shortly after the Second World War, and as far as I can tell, they've won, because I had left the UK by the time Thatcher became prime minister, but didn't matter because Reagan was then the president of the US, where I had moved to. And these are two figures that really got the neoliberal agenda in economics going. Thatcher destroyed the universities, brought in austerity. Reagan did comparable damage in the US. But I'll focus on Thatcher because it's closer to home for me. She famously said at one point, there is no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women. I think that's complete. She was a very intelligent woman, but on this issue, I think she got it completely backwards. I think what you have, what is real, is society, and individuals are a kind of abstraction from that, if you think about it. I'll come back to this point later. She also said, economics are the method, the object is to change the heart and soul. And when she said that, I don't think people perceived how sinister that is. I mean, this is a government that is setting out to change the heart and soul of the population to make them believe that they are individuals in competition with each other. And that's why you don't need anything social. You don't need a social safety net or anything, because, come on, it's a tough life. It's a jungle out there. We're all in competition with each other. Well, I think what you get now, neoliberalism won, that war of ideas won. You have the ultra-rich. I've named Robert Mercer bottom left because you may not know him. He's an American billionaire who wanted to try out. All these people have realized that they can buy the political system. They can feed the politicians enough money that they can get the policies enacted that they need. And Robert Mercer in the US decided to give it a dry run with Brexit. And he poured a lot of his millions into Brexit through, what's it called, Cambridge Analytica. And well, it worked. He got Brexit done. Brexit happened, been a complete disaster. But for Robert Mercer, it was quite a nice little victory that he'd rather people didn't know about. So some American billionaire has actually weakened the European Union by getting the UK out of it. You can't do this unless you control the media, because the media are really important in telling people what they want, how they ought to be thinking of themselves, especially bottom right, the fair and balanced Fox News. Rupert Murdoch from the very beginning was a denier that the human race had anything to do with climate. And so all over the world, his publications will give you the line that, no, it's changing, but it's natural variation or something. It's not human beings that are doing it. And now we end up with the good libertarians of Silicon Valley. I mean, they're full-on libertarians, no taxation. I don't think Jeff Bezos has paid any taxes at all in the last 10 years or so. And they know how to escape government regulation. At least they thought they did. Peter Thiel, who's one of the more behind-the-scenes members here, very influential, putting a lot of money behind the next American election. He thought seasteading would do it. We'll just establish colonies out in international waters, and they can't tax us out there because we're nowhere, and they can't regulate what we do. Elon Musk, fortunately, is going to go somewhere farther away. If not the moon, then I think Mars is the latest one, where you certainly don't have any taxes, and as far as I know, not any government either. These plans aren't very well thought through, because if you think about what happened to the people who were in the space station for a year, you know, they whirled around the Earth in that space station for a year, they came back, and they were in poor shape. Their DNA was all scrambled, and I mean, they were not only sort of physically wrecked, but not in good shape. Why? Well, cosmic rays are one thing. I mean, you know, the human body is not evolved to be whirling around in space or living on the moon. And how they exactly are thinking about propagating themselves. I mean, sex, the sexual act is pretty difficult without gravity, so I'm told. So maybe that would be the last of them if they get there. I got the words fully human in my title because they've got a plan B, not just Musk, but many of them. They're going to go post-human. I mean, forget this humanity nonsense. They're going to go post-human and upload the contents of their formidable brains to, I don't know, the cloud or somewhere where it will be safe. Then they'll get their bodies cryonically suspended, deep frozen, flash frozen, until the elixir of immortality has been discovered, and then they'll bring the bodies back and download the contents of their brains again. It's super Cartesian, hyper Cartesian fantasy, and I don't think it makes any sense. I mean, you know, I don't know about your minds, but my mind, full of memories and so on, it's actually connected with emotions and feelings and the body and so on. All that stuff can't get translated into zeros and ones. You can't upload that. So I don't quite, I mean, I've never seen any details about how this is going to work, but maybe I have to do more reading in post-humanism. But in any case, it seems to me a bit like the escape to Mars fantasy. I don't think it's been very well thought through. But why are we letting them get away with this? Well, I think there's because we're caught in this post-human prison, and this is again going back to the Silicon Valley people. Marshall McLuhan's book, which I read when it came out, didn't quite get the point of it, but it came out in 1964. And he stressed that it's the medium, it's the new technology itself, not the content of it, that matters. And that book has a wonderful chapter called The Gadget Lover, Narcissus as Narcosis. And the Greek narke is the narcissus flower with its narcotic effects, and Narcissus staring into the pool and falling in love with someone that he doesn't realize is him because, as McLuhan points out, he's been numbed by the externalization of himself. And in that chapter, McLuhan says, the narcotic effect of new technology lulls attention while the new form slams shut the gates of judgment and perception. Now, this is 1964. He's talking about the radio and television. But if you think about what's happening through the internet now, I think the gates of judgment and perception have slammed shut for a lot of people. Guy Debord, 3 years later, I think this is a much underestimated, wonderful little book. He says very much the same thing. He talks about the spectacle, this whole post-late capitalist thing that we live in, the spectacle that we live in, as being the bad dream of modern society in chains, and ultimately expresses nothing more than its desire to sleep. And the spectacle is the guardian of that sleep. So there's something about this post-capitalist spectacle that we live in, that we're immersed in, that is a lot like Plato's cave, where Socrates is saying, we've got to wake people up. You know, they're entranced by this shadow play on the walls of the cave, and they're asleep, they're sleepwalking. And Debord is saying this is exactly how technology is being used in this late capitalist phase that we're in. And right at the beginning of the book, he says something that I think captures it very well, that everything that used to be lived directly has now shifted into a representation. And that, I think, is the root of it, that philosophically, the root that so many people, they think, oh yeah, no, we're going out into nature and we're taking pictures of it with our phones. But yeah, you're just then what, do you enjoy the representations later? I don't know anyone that does. You share it immediately and then it's done and you move on. But the problem here is that this alienation from the natural world, I mean, the natural world is what we need to be kind of taking care of, paying attention to, but either we live in big cities where there isn't anything of the natural world, or even if we don't, it's all mediated through representations on our phones. And I want to point out my favorite living novelist, J.M. Coetzee. In 2002, he wrote a book, autobiographical. He was in London in the 1960s, working as a computer programmer, one of these huge mainframe computers. And he says something very interesting. And then he wrote a book about it where he's in the third person. But it's something very interesting about the effects of technology, not on the environment, but on the user. This young man, he's a real nerd. He spends his evenings, he works on a computer by day and spends his evenings reading in the history of logic. And reading about the history of logic, he comes to think there are many alternative logics. He's convinced, but how many? Each just as good as the logic of either or. So he's got Aristotle front and center, the law of excluded middle. It's going to be either or. And he's thinking, it's got to be some other logic, surely. And he goes on to say the threat of the toy by which he earns his living, that's the computer, the threat that makes it more than just a toy, is that it will burn either or paths into the brains of its users and thus lock them irreversibly into its binary logic. And I think we should engrave that sentence in letters of fire on our memories. I mean, that is amazing. That the use of the computer, which works in either or, zeros or ones, left or right, swipe left, swipe right, you know, it's you're for us or you're against us. This way of simplifying the world into binary opposites. If you spend too much time with these technologies, you might find that these either or paths are getting burned into your brain and they're affecting the way you think. And I think it started with George W. Bush, who was the reason I left the United States, because there was a man who was pretty not very capable thinker at all, could only really think, you know, you're either for us or against us, right? You have the axis of evil. He couldn't get, as Nietzsche says, it's all continua and gradations. There are no opposites. We invent opposites so that we can grasp the world and manipulate it better. But I think here's that this sentence by Coetzee is well worth pondering in the present context, because if you think of the polarization of our societies nowadays, I mean, the war that's going on and how everyone has to have an opinion. You've got to be either this side is to blame or that side is to blame. That's nuts. That's not how the world works. Nobody has 100% blame anywhere, at least that I've seen. So anyway, I think we want to think about this. Byung-Chul Han is someone else more recently, getting almost up to date, actually, talking about him. He points out many of these things. So he doesn't say he gets them from McLuhan and Debord, but I think he might have got a few of them from them. He points out the current form of neoliberal production is based on the solitary, isolated, disconnected entrepreneur of the individual self. He sees the power of this individualism coming through the technology and allowing it to manipulate us. Because if you think about what's happening in all these, with all these billion-dollar enterprises, even Amazon there. I mean, before Amazon, if you wanted to buy something, if someone had persuaded you to buy something, you'd have to go to a shop and actually probably, you know, rub shoulders with some of your fellow human beings. But no longer. We can have a pandemic and you just hit the button, you just put it in your computer or on your phone, and then suddenly the Amazon guy's at your door. And you don't even have to talk to him, you know, you just or look at him. He can just leave the package for you. And so, and it's interesting to me that in the global north, in the rich societies, we're weighed down by materialism. We buy everything. We bought all that we more and more that we need, and yet we escape into the immaterial for so much of the day into the virtual. I mean, the number of hours that people are said to spend on their phones is something is we're trying to avoid something. And again, coming back to the Cartesianism, the inertia of the body while the mind's online. You know, you don't, I mean, you stand at your desk or something, but, you know, it's not a very physically active thing to be texting with your thumbs or swiping with your index finger or so on. I mean, you know, it used to be the body used to have to work, but nowadays we tend to, again, this is coming back to the combination of getting our reality, our understanding of the world through the screen, through representations on the screen, but also doing it pretty much alone. I mean, you don't, as someone who doesn't have a smartphone, I'm particularly impressed by the number of people I see in social groups, and I think, oh, great, people are getting together, but they're not. They're all looking at their phones. And you know, the word screen is an interesting one because people say, no, we see through the screen into all these virtual worlds, and it's far out. Everything's there. But you think what a screen was originally, it was like this. It was a screen. It was something to actually cut off part of the space, part of the room, to hide something, to keep something concealed. And, you know, sorry. It works particularly well. Well, in fact, our word screen is related to a word shield. And in German, Bildschirm, the screen of your phone or of the TV, is actually image screen, an image shield. It's a wonderful, wonderful word. It's a wonderful world too, but a wonderful word. And yeah, you wonder, what are people shielding themselves from? The reason I talked about the post-human prison was that, back to McLuhan, he says that docile acceptance of media impact has made them prisons without walls for their human users. Again, back in 1964, this what should have liberated us, what we think has liberated us. And people say, yeah, we're so free, you can do anything on the internet, has actually imprisoned us. And this is not just by chance, because you have, don't try to read the small print about BJ Fogg, but you have the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab, which was designed, founded by this guy, BJ Fogg, to teach very bright nerds how to make addictive apps, how to make apps that will keep people pressing, will keep people on. And they learned gambling, they learned about dopamine, they learned about all the techniques that you can addict people, and they built them into their apps. And it was about 12 years later that suddenly somebody said, the word ethics was mentioned, and folks, oh yeah, so we've got to have Stanford said, we'd better have a course on the ethics of persuasive technology. And BJ Fogg said, oh, no, we you know, the understanding is people will use these techniques for the good. You know, they won't try to addict people, get them to buy stuff they don't need. There was a bit of blowback in a way, and he had to change the name, and it's now called the Stanford Behavior Design Lab. That sounds equally sinister to me, I have to say, because when, you know, they're designing our behavior, I mean, it's Margaret Thatcher changing minds and souls. And, you know, BJ Fogg said, oh, but look, people are free. You know, they're free not to keep clicking or pressing or swiping or whatever. Come on. Adolescent girls and boys are not known for their willpower. At least I've never known them to be known for that. And they're up against, you know, hundreds of PhDs from graduated from Stanford who've been working on this, how to actually addict people. That's not a fair contest at all. You can't say people should exert willpower, for heaven's sake. Han has talked about this when he talks about the technologies of power. He says that it doesn't, like the old forms of authoritarianism, suppress your freedom, but it rather exploits it by feeding impulse, producing addiction, intensifying drives and compulsions from within the individual. And so he has a sort of quasi-Freudian take, psychoanalytic take on these things that I think is interesting. That he says, no, you have the appearance of the illusion of freedom, but in fact you're being controlled, but the control is eventually the lack of control that's manifest in yourself. And this is a gambit of the oil companies, because the individualism of libertarianism means, no, we're responsible as individuals. And as long as you keep the responsibility on the individual, they won't question the system. But it's actually, of course, the system that needs to be questioned. The great example is British Petroleum in 2006 invented the carbon footprint calculator, shifting saying it's time to go on a low carbon diet. So each one of us has to change our behavior. And we calculate our carbon footprint. BP will help us do it on that website in 2006. And then we'll be able to generate fewer carbon emissions. Well, this was just a few years before the Deepwater Horizon disaster, also brought to you by BP, the world record oil spill. I mean, you could see it from the moon. It was so large. And so these are the people that are orchestrating such horrors and trying to put the responsibility onto the individual rather than the company. Okay, I'm going to, I should have stopped, shouldn't I? But we started a bit late. I'll just zip through this. Is that okay? Just a little longer? Are you all right? It gets more entertaining. Okay, well, this is going to be compressed, actually. I shortened it a bit this morning. Okay, the alternative to that individualism, the individualism, is that I think if you look at the East Asian traditions, you see that they have evolved techniques of self-cultivation that open you out into your relationality, into your so that you can experience your relationships with everything, and to what I would call ways of becoming truly human, not post-human or transhuman, but more human, or übermenschlich, as Nietzsche would say. And I want to start by going back to Margaret Thatcher and some interesting biology, because very often say, well, we're obviously individuals, Italian society is all these people, but individual bodies, and I can point to me and say, no, this is me, I'm this individual. Well, I'm not sure how far that will take us, because after all, we're all pointing to about 2/3, 65 to 70% of what I'm pointing to as me is H2O, which doesn't individuate me at all, because when you do the same thing, you're pointing to the same molecules in your body. And then you say, take the dry weight, take the rest of the 30% take all the water out of the body. Well, interesting fact, these mitochondria, the organelles that are within all of our human cells, the cells of the human body, and generate their energy. If you take the mitochondrion out of a cell, it dies. So the mitochondrion is the energizer of the cell. Well, once you say, well, that's interesting, they make up half our dry body weight. They're completely different DNA from our DNA. So that doesn't individuate me either, because they're the same DNA as is in the mitochondria in plants, in animals, in all other living things in the world. So only 15% is actually us when I do this. Now, if you're happy with being a 15% individual, then so be it. But it doesn't get us very far, because and what it shows is, I think, the water is common to all living things, and the mitochondria are the same and different from our DNA. Because one way of individuating is to say, well, look at my DNA, because that's really me. Yeah, but it's only 15% of my only half of my dry weight, which is 15% of the whole. Okay, now one could go to almost all the indigenous philosophies that I know about, the Yanomami, all over the world. You look at how do they understand themselves? Well, no Cartesians there. You know, Descartes is what, very recent, 17th century, very parochial, Northern Europe. But that view of us as individuals, the dualist view of us as individuals, has really, it's obviously got something to it, because it's taken over I think most of the people who don't do philosophy probably have a quasi-Cartesian view of themselves, but it's pretty rare. And if you look at self-cultivation or mindful practice, the Taoists, the Buddhists, for example, it isn't about that you've got something inside you that's yourself that you then cultivate, or at least the interesting, philosophically interesting forms aren't like that. It's rather a practice of opening the self out into its relations. And in the Chinese tradition, you go from in fact, the family is the basic unit, not the individual. The family, the individual mirrors the family in the Ditz multiple too, and has internal fathers and mothers and children and so on. But you expand the feeling for the family, the love that obtains between a well-functioning family, out and further out into the larger social units, so that to this day, the nation in Chinese, Guojia, is literally country family. It's the family that's as big as the country. And the Taoists would say, well, don't stop there. Don't start with other people, because we've got animals and plants and inanimate things, all animated by the same qi energy. And if you look at the Chinese tradition, it's everything in Chinese culture is built on qi, the arts, literature, traditional Chinese medicine. It's all the idea that we have in the Western tradition as well, that it's all one form of, or different forms of the one energy. And I think this is perfectly compatible with a lot of modern science. Sorry, we've got, well, that was meant to be Earth system science. It's compatible with the Earth system sciences that are saying, no, these are all hanging together and interacting in the same. Sorry about the little commercial here, but that's the burden of the second part of my book, is to show that there are resources in the Chinese tradition that would be really helpful for us reframing our ideas of who we are to meet the climate crisis. And not just Chinese, because once you see that the Chinese are talking this way, you've got people like the Stoics and the Epicureans, or Anaximenes, if you go back to the pre-Socratics. You've got people in the Western tradition, St. Francis, even in the Christian tradition, saying, no, we're related. St. Francis saying we're related to the moon and the stars, for heaven's sake, not just to living things. But so we do have these ideas all over, and I think we need to get back to them. You say, well, they're awfully old. Are they right? I'm a little bit of a Nietzschean and a pragmatist on this one. I don't know if they're right or not, but they certainly would work a hell of a lot better than the individualism that we have now. And so there's certainly ideas that would work better. Very quickly, what we can do, I think, try to get out of individualism, come back to our senses, because when you think about how much, if you spend a lot of time on the phone, you're mainly looking, you might be hearing as well, but you're not really doing, the sensorium is not stimulated much through the phone. We can live ecologically. I think politically speaking, the formula is very simple: get the money out of politics. Because this is the problem, that the billionaires, the libertarian billionaires, have, and I show some of it in the book. You can find the documentation on the internet. You can see how they've bought the system. They have said, we'll give you, to these politicians, this money if you enact these policies. They enact these policies. they have memos congratulating everyone, well done for doing that. We'll give you more money to do this. And so they perpetuate exactly what they want by keeping the politicians well paid. This little book by Robert Reich called The System is very well. In fact, he has a website where he condenses the book into very manageable chunks. Very, very well done. He writes clearly. He shows you the whole history of how the system is rigged because it's been bought and how we might get it back. Well, number one, especially for young people, is to vote. You know, if you have anything, shreds of a democracy left at all, you just hope elections come up soon, you get out there and vote and make it clear to the politicians, if you keep running things according to what you want and what makes you money rather than what the people actually need, the people in this nation need, you'll be out of a job. So end those fossil fuel subsidies. They're enormous. They're in trillions a year. And long ago, what was it, the G8 or the G20 said, oh, we're going to end them. But they haven't. Why? Why not? Because the fossil fuel industry keeps on funneling the money into the politicians' pockets. Tax havens and loopholes, enormous amounts of money are in the Cayman Islands. And I mean, again, trillions. There are good books on this I can recommend. Money that's just, you know, belongs to dictators and oligarchs all over the world. It's just disappeared. It's not in the economy. They just siphoned it off. And you break up monopolies and strengthen trade unions and so on. And you can do all this while you know, if you've heard fair and just transition to a carbon-free economy, it's nonsense. And people say, I know you want to make the poor countries even poorer, and the poor people in your country, you want to screw them even more. No. All the proposals I've seen for this transition have said, no, it's got to be fair and just. You've got to do a lot of redistribution. You can call out these banks. I mean, they keep, look, this is after Paris, 3.8 trillion in those 4 years for fossil fuel projects. There are now quite a few more Chinese banks have entered this business because these fossil fuel companies can't do the exploration for more fossil fuels without money, and they get the money from the banks. So the banks are a way to, I mean, they can be named and shamed, I'm sure. The World Bank, for heaven's sake, there's only one of them, spent billions of dollars backing fossil fuels in 2022. They say 3.7 billion. And even though they said, no, we'll stop doing this. No, they're still doing it. And it's totally political. Make polluters pay carbon border tariffs. You know, when a country starts to do things, they can impose, you can make the playing field more level. You say, but the Chinese will keep on polluting. Well, not if we erect border tariffs to say, no, we're going to equalize this out. And there's an idea of a climate club where the nations come together and say, we need to do this, we need to work on this together. Just last point is that gross domestic product. Amazing that Robert Kennedy in 1968, in a campaign speech, he was campaigning for the presidency, talked about at some length about gross domestic product and said, yeah, it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. And I think he's right. It's a hopeless measure of human well-being. And so the degrowth movement, which is gaining strength, I'm glad to see, is saying we need to degrow to get below planetary boundaries. We need to reduce, and in fact, we need to get rid of GDP. As there are other measures of how well the society is doing, and it needs to be connected with redistribution, because as you saw from the very beginning, the inequality in wealth, not that there isn't enough wealth, it's that it's gone to the 0.01% for the last 50 years. You know, it just needs to be redistributed. You need to tax those people. And so Tim Jackson is another person who's written good things about this, and saying we can have prosperity without GDP growth. Economics for a finite planet. I mean, you know, we've had this image of the finite planet for what, 20, how long ago was that photograph taken? It's finite, for heaven's sake. You can't keep on growing on a finite planet. And Jason Hickel's less is more is good because he cites a lot of studies that show that larger gross domestic product does not improve quality of life beyond a certain point. Once you get to an adequate standard of living, in fact, it makes it worse because I get more money, I buy more cars, but my neighbor has more expensive cars than I do, so I have to buy different cars, and you know how consumerism works. So this is the one thing that gives me hope, is that the super rich at the moment have the power. They've got the political power because they've bought it. But we have the numbers because, you know, the people on the side of most of the developing nations are all for changing things because it will help them. And most of us in the developed world, except for the super rich, should be working towards this. Robert Reich says, makes the good point that left or right doesn't mean anything anymore. It's really the gap between the super rich and the rest of us that's the important one. And so we do have the numbers. Definitely 8 billion of us who ought to be interested in saving, not destroying the planet. And so we have to disempower the perpetrators, rage against the machine, and take the power back.
So thank you so much, Ram, for this wonderful lecture.
Thank you for being so patient and being
I mean,
a good audience. And
it was really a pleasure. So now we can open the debate. If anyone has questions, you can raise your hand through Zoom or physically. So just let's wait, or maybe before people think I can start asking questions, because actually you mentioned, you know, self-cultivation. So I would like you to say something more on that. So how do you think self-cultivation can help us living more ecologically?
Yeah, good question, because I didn't say much about that. I mean, let me give an example. I practiced Tai Chi Chuan for a long time, for many years, decades. And, you know, there's 108 moves, and you have to remember what order they come in. And I practiced it for a year from a Chinese master in Berkeley who didn't speak any English. So all you did was follow the moves. And I was about to give up because I thought, man, I put a lot of time into this, and I'm still not quite getting. I could feel I was getting stretched out and stronger and so on. And then one day it happened in a parking lot behind a furniture store on Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley, where I was halfway through the form, and suddenly it clicked. And so the movements were coming through me perfectly. And I wasn't doing it anymore. I was just, it was the world was doing it. And it didn't last for too long, because of course, after a while, I thought, wow, this is far out. And then of course, that broke the spell. But those few seconds taught me something about chi energies and that whole philosophy that's behind Tai Chi Chuan. And that is that, of course, the source of my movements, whatever I do, doesn't come from inside me. It comes from the powers of heaven and earth, because none of us can move without gravity. So you need that. You need the earth. You need energy into the body that the body doesn't generate its own energy. It comes from the sun, through plants, and if you eat animals, through animals and so on, and then you incorporate that energy by eating through metabolism and so on. So what interests me is that you've got a physical sense there of that my acts and my activities are only in some minimal sense performed by me as an individual, but are actually dependent on my interconnection with the powers of heaven and earth. And if I'm doing something with the help of fossil fuels, that's also a matter of energy that's coming through the sun. And coming from the sun in the Carboniferous period and is now being sort of recaptured. So what interests me is that if we see, okay, physically, what we do as embodied beings is dependent on the whole thing, on the whole system. Think about that psychologically, or in terms of motivation. And I think if we take the cue from the Chinese and the family, I'm married, and if my life is motivated by what's good for me as an individual and what I as an individual think all the time, that's probably not going to be a very harmonious marriage because there's someone else involved. And so let's say then I get good at doing what the Confucians suggest in self-cultivation: put yourself in the other person's position. So see it from the other person's point of view. Easier said than done, but if you know someone, you can do it. It's not easy in an argument because exasperated one of the parties saying, "Why can't you see it from my point of view?" Well, because I couldn't argue if I saw it from your point of view. Wouldn't be any point. But yeah, if you can gradually start to see things from the other person's point of view, or even a sort of Nietzschean, Zhuangzian move is to say, not just other people, but other beings in the world, to see the situation from the opposite perspective and then triangulate or calibrate or whatever, so that then I think the Confucian, the good Confucian or the Taoist sage or the Zen master, I think their motivations don't come from their own psyches personally, because the whole point is in Buddhism, anatman is no self, right? So they come from the situation. And so I think in the Tai Chi example, I had integrated my activities into the field of energies that was the world right there. And if you think of it in terms of motivations and desires and so on, yes, things go a lot better if we take other people's desires into account and what they want and what moves them. And yeah, the practice or the cultivation of interacting with people in a less self-centered and egocentric manner really does make for, I think, harmony, makes for working together much easier and so on. So that would be one place to start, to see that the notion of the individual as the source doesn't really make sense within a system, because we live within the Earth system, and we live in a society which is already a social system that antedates us, that comes before us. And we come into the world as a result of an interaction of two individuals, unless we're in a test tube. But that to me is significant. There's that interaction where it's sperm and egg, bang, and then that's the beginning of me or you or whoever. And if we can keep that idea of acting within a field of interactions and being fluid in our Nietzsche uses, and Zhuangzi used the word wandering among perspectives, being free to flexible, to see things differently. Because we've got at the moment in our polarized societies, we've got the total opposite of that. Everyone digging into their own position. If I have to be right, you have to be wrong if you don't agree with me. And that's not how we. I mean, that doesn't work very well. It seems to be empirically obvious. Our societies are not humming along harmoniously by any means.
So, I mean, to summarize, we can say that self-cultivation is more of a precondition for behaving ecologically.
Yes, because I think it shifts your activities away from being self-centered and out to a much broader context. And that context, of course, includes the Earth systems, includes the natural world. And I mean, Angus Graham says something interesting talking about Zhuangzi and Taoism, where he talks about the need for clarity, to be aware of what's going on within the maximum relevant context. And I think one of the problems with Cartesian dualism and a lot of our Western dualisms, figure ground and so on, is a classic one. We like to concentrate on figures. And when you concentrate on the figure, you lose the ground. You can't, I mean, you can practice seeing both at the same time. But the Taoists would be saying, no, expand it to what is the maximum, the broadest relevant context to my action. And if you try to experience it that way, you realize, yes, it has that, if I buy a pair of running shoes from Amazon or something, that's a context I'm enmeshed in a system there whereby I may not intend to support child labor in prisons in China or wherever the hell these things are made, or if I eat beef that comes from South America where they've burned down the Amazon to graze the cattle, I'm supporting that system. And so this kind of self-cultivation that I think is helpful expands our awareness, makes us more aware of where we're coming from and the results. I mean, it's a very Buddhist thing, right? The results of the consequences of our actions.
Thank you very much. I see. People wrote in the chat. So the question is, do you think there is a danger of individuals gazing too long into the abyss and taking action that is drastic rather than beneficial? He's saying, for example, a large portion of society in the UK displays annoyance with groups like Just Stop Oil, rather than realizing that they are taking action against the destruction of our environment.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question and a very good example because, I mean, I think Extinction Rebellion in the UK has specifically renounced doing things that will annoy other people. And I mean, I was thinking, there's a book, I don't know if you've read it, called, what's the man's name? He's Norwegian, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. The title is memorable, so I don't need to remember the author, but he's Norwegian. And he doesn't exactly provide instructions, but he does point out that many social movements, as long as they remained low-key and pacifist and so on, didn't get traction until they actually started to sort of destroy some property here and there. And so his idea is that maybe some pipelines could be, I mean, pipelines are pretty vulnerable. But I think that question points it up. You've got to understand the context and exactly what's going on. Who are you disadvantaging? If you stand in front of cars on motorways, yeah, you're pissing off a lot of people, a lot of drivers, and maybe you're stopping emergency vehicles getting to their destination. That's the classic thing. People say, yeah, people died because of your blockade. So I don't think those things are very helpful. However, I mean, the blow up a pipeline guy also talks about this group called the tire extinguishers. Have you heard of them? You can Google them. They have a website, and if you see an SUV on a lonely street at night, you can unscrew the cap of the tire valve, put in a lentil and screw it back on. And all 4 times, if you do that 4 times, all 4 tires simply deflate. And they've done this in a lot of countries, and they put a piece of paper in the on the windscreen saying, let's explain why we're doing this. I don't know if you understand what you're doing with this vehicle, unnecessarily polluting and being dangerous and so on and so forth. And that's one where that made me think that, you know, young people seem to be, SUVs are now 45%, I read, of new car sales, automobile sales worldwide. It's crazy. I mean, they are, this is marketing for you and consumerism. And they are more dangerous for the rest of us, but also even for the people inside, because the center of gravity is so high that if you have to swerve to avoid hitting something, they roll over much more easily than cars or normal pickup trucks. And so you're actually you're not as safe as you think you are, being so high and encased by lots of steel. And apparently young people aren't buying them as much as older people. And I can imagine a world where it would be extremely uncool to own an SUV. So uncool that when people pass by your SUV, they take out your keys, their keys as they walk by, and you have, if you want to get a paint job, I mean, you're going to have to get a paint job if your SUV keeps being scratched. I think those sorts of things, you know, people, I think in SUVs that don't care. There was an article about yacht owners, super yacht owners. They congregate in Monaco. Monaco has a huge harbor for super yachts. And they did an investigation talking to people who were buying these super yachts at some big super yacht jamboree, and saying, aren't you concerned about the effects on other people and on the climate because these super yachts, you know, generate enormous amounts of emissions? And basically, they said, oh, hadn't really thought about it. Some said, I don't care. I mean, that's your real individualist. But the other people, yeah, they just hadn't thought about it. Well, I think if you saw that SUVs started having lots of scratches on them, and either, of course, most owners are rich enough to be able to have them repainted all the time, or if not, they carry the badge of shame to be seen by all. It seems to me that would bring about, people would think twice about buying an SUV under those circumstances. Might make them think, oh, maybe I am doing something profoundly unnecessary. I mean, it's gratuitously increasing the harm to other people. Not only, by the way, polluting, you know, I mean, this is another thing, that cars, it's socially acceptable to own and drive a car, has been for so long. It's going to be difficult to change that. But when you think about driving a car in a city, the pollution you're causing, that people on bikes and people walking by can't, unless they wear gas masks, they've got to inhale it. And the other thing is the tires. The stuff that comes off car tires is these 4.5 particles, definitely not good for your lungs. And SUVs being heavier and having bigger tires and so on produce more of this stuff. I think it's a matter of getting people to realize more and more, you know, more what the consequences of our actions. And I think that question points up that you've got to realize, yes, if you're going to act to try to change things, you have to be aware of, well, who else might be being harmed by it. The thing with fossil fuels is, you know, you can name and shame banks, you can take your money out of banks. It's hard to boycott the fossil fuel industry because unless you live off the grid, you know, in the country somewhere, you're dependent on them. So, but when you see how they are continuing to do what they do, and you see it's because they pay the politicians to set up the system, to keep the system the way it is with all the subsidies and so on. There's an entry point where voting, democracy in action, the voting age in Austria, I don't know what it is in Italy, it's 16 now in Austria. That's a lot of young people who, tend to take to the streets with Fridays for Future, but they really, I mean, it's good that they do that, but the politicians just go, oh yeah, we see you. But if the politicians were told, we're voting en masse next time for someone that's not you, for someone that's going to be acting more in our interest. And that leads to another problem in Austria, because there's a thing in Germany called lobby control that makes it transparent how much money the politicians are getting from where. And I looked into having an Austrian branch, but the data protection laws in Austria conveniently make it that you can't find out how much money the politicians are getting from where. And that's the first step, because if they're making decisions based on how much income they're making, then you've got to change that part of the system at the beginning, so we know, we can see it. And then people who vote could say, okay, we're going to, there is an organization in America that's encouraging people to be free of lobbyists and encouraging politicians to be free of to pledge that they're not taking money from outside sources. That's really an important one, and that can be done. Surely, the only people that harms are the politicians themselves get poorer, but you're not aggravating, you're not pissing off people who might be upset at what you're doing. You're in their way. You're just saying, no, we're going to change the system. And I think if more people could see that, I mean, and this is where people like Donald Trump especially, but a lot of people like him in politics have been very clever in saying, no, the problem is that elite over there. It's not us. And to see that it isn't a matter of left and right, and that I ought to be able to get through to, I'm trying to learn how to get through to people, blue collar workers for whom I, as an ex-hippie, professor, ex-professor, and so on, some kind of elite, I don't know, who wouldn't listen. But now we've got to somehow get beneath those divisions, because it seems to me that we all could be in this together. I mean, not all of us, but most of us could be in this together, because we all have an interest in not making so much of the planet uninhabitable. We have a question here from a real person, a body in the same space.
Just a couple of points. One is don't you think that I mean we are leaving certain deformation and distortion of capitalism, but I am thinking how to, after all, it's still a system, I think, that sort of dwells and allows some form of democracy. So my problem is alternative systems are actually sustainable for a large-scale democracy, in a sense that I think that's what we have seen experimentally happening. Historically, you see, okay, capitalism, after all, does not, I mean, with all the distortions that are there, influenceability and so on, how money can change, again, sort of influence the opinions of and so on. But still, we can say that the world where democracy is in place sort of managed to have some form of democracy. So my problem is, what about that? This is the one point. I had another thing. But this is just a general question about nudging. What do would you consider when that is done properly, with keeping a sort of freedom of choice, whether that is something that you would support. And there are some environmental, nudging in that sense, little things, larger things, but there is quite a bit about that kind of persuasion, if you wish, we can call it that way, so use of the positive use of that kind of persuasion to perhaps even call the attention to the context that you were saying, not only the figure, but the context, okay, so make people think about something that they don't normally think. They focus on the figure, they focus then on the background through a sort of a nudging, little suggestion somehow. And no, the third point was about, it seemed to me that you were saying that that the individual responsibility is not an important, whereas for me it's very important. I mean, we should probably start. I mean, we can only start by changing ourselves and rather than others, no? So the change always, according to, starts from within. And because you made this example of the VP, and you said, well, it seemed to say that it seemed to me that you were suggesting that we should not change our diets because. But I don't think this is the intention, right? Or
and that's connected a bit with the nudging issue as well. Thank you. I mean, the first point, democracy. I think that that book by Robert Reich, The System. He shows pretty convincingly, as other people have shown, that in the US, at least, it's an example of an advanced capitalist democracy. It's a plutocracy. It isn't really a democracy. And I forget the name of it, but there's a couple of people at Princeton who published a very influential paper about 5 years ago, showing that if you compare what voters who had voted in the last election, and also on sort of local issues as well, what they were wanting, what they were saying, this is what we want. They compared that to the policies that were actually enacted. The influence was about 5%. That they had almost no influence. That they're all voting, but it didn't bloody well matter because the politicians do what they are told to do by the people who are paying them. So I think that I do hold out hope. I think if we can fix our democracies, or I think there are some good ones.
For example, like perhaps America represents a real, like the distorted, where capitalism actually does really distort the nature of the democracy. Perhaps some European democracies are more
maybe in Scandinavia or Finland. Some of them seem to work more democratically, and it will be interesting to see a sort of worldwide study like that. Say, what do the wishes of the electorate that just voted? How does it compare with what the policies that get enacted are? The nudging. Sorry, I should have made it clear. I mean, of course, I think individual responsibility is very important. And at the same time, the system has to be changed. And so I think there are two. I didn't separate them enough. I will next time. That we'd say, yes, what can we do individually? Because of course we can do a lot of things. I don't think I skipped over the food system. Because you look at the global food system, you look at what stopping or reducing eating meat, what an effect that has. I mean, those are huge. And those are things that could be, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people associate being vegetarian or vegan with cranks and long-haired hippies and so on. It'd be good if we could get underneath those, somehow dismantle those prejudices. But yes, the nudging, I think, you mentioned it yourself in that connection, to get people to be aware of the larger context. Because I think that the narcissism, I mean, the studies have shown that social media, heavy social media use increases narcissism. And that doesn't help us at all in terms of being aware of what we, I mean, Donald Trump is such a narcissist, he doesn't even seem to be aware of anyone else in the world except his family, or anything, we've become so self-centered. And it's a hard thing. I mean, one shouldn't put it that way, but there must be ways, and it was really an answer to your question, Laura, the self-cultivation, to say, look, here's, and also I'm not telling anyone what to do. I don't have the authority. I really try to avoid ethics, except in terms of fairness and justice, those very basic ideas. Because when you start talking about ethics and what people should do, you might start to sound like a preacher or some elite, that knows ethics. So what I'm trying to do is to say, well, look, here's the situation we're in. It's pretty serious. Do we want to go on this way? Now, some people might say, yeah, we're having fun over-consuming. Well, okay, fine. But maybe if people were to realize where we're headed with that. And I think that one thing I didn't mention, one reason people are happy to go on is that they think some technology will help us, will come in and save us.
Yeah.
There's this guy, Mark Andreessen, who was, I think he's a shadowy figure in Silicon Valley, but he is, people call him the philosopher of Silicon Valley, but he was Google or something, very rich. He's got this super hyper individualist philosophy, and he's got this manifesto that says more technology will absolutely save us, and we'll be happier than ever. But it's none of the scientists say that sucking carbon out of the air could ever be a viable, I mean, not in the next 50 years, which is when we need it.
Yeah, to rely on that is too much of a bet.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
So, so that's a problem. And so I think I want to say that balance, the things we can do fall into two categories: the things we can do in our lives, in our families, with our friends, and so on, and the things we can do to change the system. Because if we only do the individual responsibility stuff, it won't change things enough. The system is fossil fuels are too entrenched in our system to be able to change it.
Yeah. I see in that sense. Of course, it's a combination of the individual choices with the larger choices. But the point is that also, I guess, a little bit of a problematic part for me is to say, in a sense, that the dialectic of the very rich and the poor is also that somehow, I mean, the economics is also an interconnected system, as we are with nature. In a sense, we also, our economy is a symbol, is an emblem of interconnection between institutions and people, and so there is a little bit, in a sense, those people are rich because there are consumers who buy those things, and also in a sense we are definitely responsible for that. I understand that we have a limit. I mean, we are not fully responsible, but we are responsible for their wealth and their perpetration of the same policies and so on. So in that sense, individual responsibility. It's again something related to seeing the broader context, rather than saying, okay, there's this group that we should change, or that we are also feeding them. I mean, we are part of that in the sense that we are feeding the system. It's again a contextual change, no? Because you're saying
Thank you. And I think that I mean, related to that is the nudge that we're feeding this system because it's so distorted. I mean, the economic system where you externalize all the pollution and so on, you say, no, that's not where nature, the natural world, doesn't even figure in classical economics. It's free stuff. The only money you have to pay is to extract it. But it's never. So they say, well, put a price on nature. So I don't know how much that helps. But if we were to, because people say, oh, you're going to take away my SUV and my hamburgers. I would say, no, I just want to make you have to pay the real price for the SUV and the hamburgers. That when you factor in the externalities that the economic system puts onto the rest of us, not anyone outside it. And those are, in a way, nudges, because suddenly the price of SUVs goes up, and the price of meat goes up. So I think these are And people say, well, you ought to be offering more carrots and brandishing fewer sticks. I mean, gosh, sticks and carrots is always the metaphor used here. You say, well, okay, the sticks are going to be how much you pay for the stuff that's environmentally damaging. The carrot is a big carrot, namely, you breathe less pollution. You have a planet to live on, as opposed to, you know, because I mean, I don't think a friend of mine used to say, you underestimate how resilient human beings are. You know, we won't be wiped out. I don't think we're bringing about the end of the human race. But when you look at the consequences of climate change and the biosphere integrity being lost, what it means is less and less of the planet will be habitable. You know, nowhere near the coast, you can't live there. You can't live in many other places because they're too hot. There's going to be 8 billion of us all trying to live in Scotland or, you know, or up in the Alps or somewhere. And what will turn up there, but Bill Gates and Peter Thiel will be there already with fortresses and guns. So I mean, it's just, I don't think we're going to extinguish the human race very immediately, but the more we reduce the areas of the planet we can live on, we're seeing it now, you know, migration and resource wars and so on. So, and again, that's there's not much of a carrot to say we can avoid that, but it's something because it's a sort of non-carrot. It's when you see how life will be if we keep on, and that's really what I'm trying to get people to think about. But then, of course, you have to get them to realize that the technology won't fix this. And I think a lot of people, you know, because I think once you understand the situation, you can't not care. You know, I think you've got to be. People say, well, don't frighten people too much. You know, enough people. I mean, in a way, it's that situation has changed. Students I taught used to teach on these issues, didn't care much until recently, but now people say, oh, we can't do anything, we have climate anxiety, and somehow we've got to acknowledge that, but saying, no, we can do something. There's lots of things we can do
that is a bit,
to make things less bad.
I agree, because otherwise, then the scenario is the doom scenario. Well, for people, then then we don't do anything. I mean, we are doomed anyway. So this is also, I think, very, very bad to have this message, no? And we still have to feel that we can act and responsible and we can affect. We can
have the effect. But it's I mean, I'm getting a little, because I'm getting old, I'm getting tired. I mean, I'm thinking, gosh, should I not just drink more beer and just forget about it? I'm not going to be, I mean, I used to say to students, look, your generation will be hard hit. I don't have a personal stake. And I think it's important that, you know, I'm not getting paid by anyone. I don't have investments in green energy. I don't have investments in anything. I'm really not going to be here when it gets really bad. But for decades, I've said, I won't be, I'll be long gone when it gets bad. I didn't expect in 2023, I'd still be here, and it's really bad already. But no, I think that you put it right. The doom, somehow you've got to say, the situation is bad, but we can change it.
Irascible in a way.
And secretly we say to ourselves, make it less bad, but not that we can, you know, get back to the Garden of Eden anytime soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Thank you.
So we have time for a very last question. So, let's summarize Rebecca's question. So, I mean, you spoke about posthumanism and so on, but Rebecca, she wants to know more about that. And her question is, is your criticism more of transhumanism than posthumanism?
Yeah, I'm not sure because I don't know both of them well enough. I mean, I think there's that cyborg element. I don't know in which one it figures most, that we'll gradually keep replacing ourselves because or replacing parts of our bodies. Because certainly in posthumanism, this fellow Max Moore, I don't know if you come across him, he was the one who got some manifesto going early enough. And basically, he was he thinks he's a Nietzschean, but he claims to be a Nietzschean, but he's kind of ressentiment, 100%, because he said, damn it, we've been given these bodies and they wear out and they don't function properly. And, we've got a raw deal as humans. We're going to do better than this. And I just think that I can't get very excited about that attitude. However, when it comes to replacing arthritic hips, I'm kind of thinking that's a good idea. Actually, that saved my life. But then I think again, I don't know. And this is another thing that I think we learn, or at least I have learned from Buddhism and Taoism, East Asian philosophies generally, that rather than make generalizations, and say, okay, so we have some new rules here or some new generalizations that we can work from, principles. We'll replace the humanist principles with the transhumanist or posthumanist principles. I think we need to drop principles altogether because I think with cyborg replacements, you've got to look at the context. You've got to look at how much do these operations cost. I mean, I wouldn't be able to see if I hadn't had a cataract operation not long ago. And they're relatively cheap, relatively easy. And I know they've worked for a lot of people. And I would say, yeah, those in general are, you might want people to be able to see better for longer. But but if you take that attitude too far, you get, no, this whole thing is hopeless. And many of these posthumanists really want to transcend being embodied at all. And that's why I think that, call me old-fashioned, but the Übermensch, the overhumanism is where I would stick. I mean, I think Nietzsche has the right idea in saying, okay, at least as I read him, part of the point of overcoming the human is to overcome the human-centered way of living and the human-centered standpoint. And it's to open us out to the natural world and give us a more ecological idea. I mean, that's certainly what I think is going on in Zarathustra. And so he's not a humanist because you only become fully human by realizing in the dual sense of waking up to, but also enacting, making real your humanity in the natural context, in the context of the whole world. And so that seems to me, and in Nietzsche's case, of course, it leads to the thought of eternal recoming and so on, and an affirmation of everything that's natural, the way it is. So that would require, for me, some modification, but I think I can't answer Rebecca's question until I have a much better sense of how transhumanism differs from posthumanism. I think I've read more of the posthumanists, and they it's all too Cartesian for me. It leaves me cold. But I don't, it's a good question because I certainly don't want to, I think humanism is a dead end as well. And that we need something more like an overhumanism that we get from Nietzsche.
Thank you very much, Graham, for
Well,
your lecture again and for your insightful answers.
Thank you again for being here and
Thank you
those
for being
questions.
here, and thank you to the online audience. So see you next time, next week actually, on the 30th of November. We will have Martin Weiss, who will speak about Hans Jonas. So thank you so much again, Graham, and
I'll try to be here for that, or there for that.
okay.
Somewhere for that.
And see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.